Our text today is going to come from Hebrews chapter 7. We're going to be in verses 1 through 10. And the title of the sermon is A Priesthood That is Superior to Israel's. A priesthood that is superior to Israel's. And this is a beautiful little gem. Chapter 7, this is just a tiny little tip of the iceberg, verses 1 through 10. And he's going to spend all the way from chapter 7 to chapter 10 talking about this same theme. So we're just going to lay some groundwork this morning and just kind of touch on the subject to introduce us to it. I want to pick up back in verse 17, just to remind us what the preacher is doing in this part of the text in Hebrews. Let's read it and then we'll start to exposit our text. So verse 17. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. Verse 19, and we have this as a sure and a steadfast anchor of the soul. And verse 20, Jesus, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the preacher here is talking to his audience of Jewish people that have come into Christianity, but as a consequence of coming into this new faith, they're starting to have hankerings for the old faith. They're missing the temple worship. They're missing the big cultic aspect of the worship, the priestly aspect of the worship, the sacrificial aspect of the worship, and they're being tempted to go back to that old system. And so he says here, he's giving them things to hold on to, things that they can anchor to in the new faith, realizing that God's purpose is unchangeable. So the fact that God has ushered in a new faith, a new way of relating to him, he says this has always been the case. God's purpose is unchangeable, so you should be very secure in it. God guarantees our faith with his own promise, his own oath. And that was last week's sermon. And then he gets to the part where he says, I've got something exciting and profound and mysterious that I want to explain to you, but I'm afraid that you're sluggish and you're not paying attention and you're not really tracking with me, and this new thing is going to be very hard to explain if you're not really on the edge of your seat, paying attention and willing to grasp on. And that was another part of last week or a couple weeks ago. Don't be sluggish in your faith. So that's what he's wrestling with. And he introduces the idea of this new promise that we can hold on to, that we can anchor ourselves to, is Jesus as a new high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And that's going to be the content that we're looking at today. What did this mean for Israel? If there is a new high priest and a new order of priesthood, whenever you have a changing of the priesthood, you also have a changing of the law, a changing of how God is dealing with his people. And so for these Israelites, they were used to their traditions, their tradition of how they would worship and sing and celebrate. And that tradition was 1,200 years old. Can you imagine 1,200 years of family history in a denomination, let's say? You're in it, your grandpa was in it, your great-great-grandpa was in it, your great-great-great-grandpa was in this tradition, and now you're realizing God has created a new tradition and it's time to abandon this old one. That would be a tough pill to swallow. So what the preacher is going to say in our text today is, hey, there is a historical reality that predates the Aaronic Levitical priesthood. He's going to point to a historical reality that predates Aaron and Moses. He's going to point back to a historical reality that not only predates the Jewish faith, but it was also superior to Abraham, the father of the Israelites. Introducing something that was superior to Abraham. Even Abraham had to bow down to it and pay a tithe to it. So this new faith that we're all a part of, this tradition of the Melchizedek order of a priesthood, predated everything else, and it was superior to everything else. And that is how we should rest confidently, he is saying, because God already knew what he was doing, and the plan he had from the beginning is unchangeable, unmovable, and it is founded on promises. And that's what we're going to find out about today. One aspect of what we're going to look at today is this awesome, unparalleled reality of the God that we serve. The God that we serve has made it clear that he shows us the end from the beginning. God makes the claim that I'm the one that reveals to you the future way before it ever happens. And that's how you can know that I alone am God and there is no other God like me, because no other God can tell you the future before it ever happens. And that's a piece of what we're going to look at today. Let me give you an example. This is kind of an apologetic for us guys. If anybody would say, how do you know your God is the true God? How do you know that the book that you look at is the true book? And I would say it's because of the multiplications of prophecies that God has said ahead of time that actually happen, to where you can no longer doubt that he knows what he's talking about. Let me give you an idea of what it would be like to build up a faith and a trust in someone who can tell you the future before it ever happens. Let's say that, just for fun, guys, this is not scripture. I'm just trying to give you an analogy. Let's say when I began preaching here 8 years ago, guys, it's been 8 years that we've been together. If somebody would have said, Tony, one of our members prophesied that you would be our preacher. Now, you would probably think, it's a little strange. But let's say they reveal something to you. Let's say that they tell you, yes, Tony, decades ago, back when we were still over on Sylvester, is that the old building? Back when we were over on Sylvester Street, Tony, somebody stood up and said that in the future, we would have a preacher named Tony. Now, would that be confident building all by itself? Probably not a huge prediction. Coincidence, preacher named Tony, probably not enough proof. But let's say they say, well, in the future, we're going to have a preacher named Tony, and I'm going to announce that he will be born in Whittier, California. Oh, well, now we're getting just a little bit more specific, aren't we? This can't just be any Tony. This has got to be a very specific Tony. And then they go on and they continue adding to these prophecies, and something unique. He'll be born in California, but he'll spend his first Christmas over in Peru. How many Tonys are going to fit this description? And let's say he keeps piling them on. Not only will he attend his first Christmas in Peru, but he's going to attend grade school at a Catholic school in Houston, Texas. Now the odds are starting to stack up, aren't they? The probability of just any guy meeting all of these predictions is starting to get impossible. And let's build on that one more time. And by the way, before he comes to preach for us, he'll be a musician. He'll make his living as a musician. Now, if somebody was to have said all of those things way back when you were meeting on Sylvester Street, would you think that they were a prophet? Yeah, that's pretty good. It's pretty good to come up with all of that. So just an idea that the Bible and God has layered so many prophecies that are specific and we have seen come true that God says, I'm the only one that can do that. And that's why you should have faith in me. Let me take you to Isaiah chapter 46 and verse 9. God makes this claim. Remember what happened long ago, because I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I declare the end, meaning the future, from the beginning, and ancient times from what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand and all my good pleasure I will accomplish. And that's what our pericope is about today, guys. Another one of God's prophecies, another type and a shadow that God put in the Old Testament to let us know what the future would look like. This particular type and shadow is going to involve Abraham and Jerusalem. Now, we've already seen one type and a shadow from Abraham and Jerusalem, and it's when God asked Abraham to take his promised son Isaac up to Mount Moriah. And on that mountain, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac to me. Do you remember the story? So Abraham follows God's instructions. Now, Mount Moriah is just outside of Jerusalem, close enough to be called the same thing. So Abraham follows God's instructions. God stops him and at the last minute says, don't do it. I'll provide the sacrifice. Here we are on a mountain next to Jerusalem. And God says, I'm the one that's going to provide the sacrifice. And so Abraham named that place, on the mountain, God will provide. And what that was a type and a shadow that men would not make the sacrifices for their sin, but on God's holy mountain, Mount Zion, God would provide the sacrifice himself. And that was a type and a shadow of Jesus, the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world. Now that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. Types and shadows told ahead of time. Well, the type and the shadow that we're going to look at today also concerns Abraham, and it also concerns Jerusalem. The preacher takes us back before Abraham and Isaac. Before Isaac, back to just Abraham. And the preacher is going to highlight a type and a shadow that was revealed in Genesis regarding Abraham and Jerusalem. Now, to give us a little background to how this works, we're going to be taken to Genesis chapter 14. That's the text that the preacher draws from. And all of Genesis 14 is dedicated to describing something that was called the War of the 5 Kings against the 4 kings. So, what was this? Abraham and Lot had come to a place and they had grown too big to stay together. So Abraham tells Lot, why don't you look up and pick whatever land you want? You can have that land. I'll go to a different land. So Lot looks up and Lot sees the plain of the Jordan. We talked about the Jordan this morning. It was interesting. This morning's topic was things that happened outside of Jericho along the Jordan. But what we're talking about today happens along the Jordan plain, but further south on the east side of the Dead Sea. An area where Sodom and Gomorrah was located. And that happened to be an area that looked very fertile, very lush, very well watered. And so when Lot saw it, he said, ooh, that's the best piece of land. Plenty of water, plenty of green. I'm going to head down there, Abraham. You can go somewhere else. Now, I'm amazed by that story because the area that Lot sees is called the Jordan Plain, extending all along the Jordan River and extends all the way down following the Dead Sea. Lot says, that looks like the Garden of Eden. That looks like Egypt with the water. So that's where I'm going. And Lot didn't realize that that happened to be the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. And what Lot couldn't see, because he was overtaken by the beauty, is that that land was in turmoil. There were 5 kings that governed that area, the plain of the Jordan, 2 of them being the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and there were 3 other kings. But they were vassal states of an area called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is one of the oldest cultures in the world. It's the area over where Iraq is today. Babylon, most of us are familiar with Babylon. One of the 4 kings that was dominating these 5 kings on the Jordan Plain was from Babylon. So these 4 kings over here in Mesopotamia had conquered this plain of the Jordan. So these 5 kings on the plain of the Jordan are sick and tired after 13 years of being oppressed and having to pay tribute. They're getting sick and tired of being dominated by Mesopotamia, and they're going to rebel against the 4 kings. And that's a conflict that Lot didn't see coming. So the story goes, these 4 kings from Mesopotamia came in, created war with the 5 kings of the Jordan Plain. They lost. The Mesopotamians took all of their bounty and they took Lot and they started heading home. Now, when you head home, you have to go north up the Jordan Plain, cross over the Jordan at some point, go up through Syria and Damascus, and then over across to the Euphrates and go home. Abraham found out that they had captured Lot. So Abraham rounds up 318 of his own family members, and they take off after these Mesopotamians. As they take off, they're following them up north, and they catch up. They pass through Jerusalem, and they finally catch up. Abraham finally catches up with them in Damascus, capital of Syria. And there Abraham defeats the Mesopotamian kings. Abraham takes all of the bounty that they had taken, and Abraham gets his nephew Lot? Somebody check me. Abraham gets Lot back and begins bringing Lot back home. And the account that we have in Genesis chapter 14 is on his way back down south, on his way back home, right about the time he gets to Jerusalem. The king of Sodom goes up to meet Abraham and to thank Abraham for saving them. That's in chapter 14. Now, that's what the story of chapter 14 is about. The wars and the kings. That's what the story is about. But there is something very peculiar that happens, and only 3 verses are dedicated to this little tiny mysterious event that gets interjected into this war story. I think I should have given you this before we got to Genesis 14, Genesis 13, verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other, and Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So Lot made a bad choice. He couldn't see what was coming. So chapter 14 recaptures the story of this war, Abraham's victory. Abraham is coming back right about Jerusalem. The king of Sodom goes up and meets Abraham there and thanks him. And there is where, while they're near Jerusalem, a strange figure comes out of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at this time is called Salem. It's not called Jerusalem yet, but can you see the word Salem in the word Jerusalem? Jerusalem. So this strange character, not an Israelite, comes out of Jerusalem, gets thrown into the story. And let's look at what that looks like. Genesis 14 and verse 17. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, that's one of the 4 kings of Mesopotamia, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. Now, the valley of Shaveh, where the king of Sodom meets Abraham, is in the valley right next to the Kidron Valley. It's right between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. So right there is where the king of Sodom stops Abraham. And while they're stopped is when this mysterious, enigmatic priest king comes out of Jerusalem that seemingly has nothing to do with the story at all. We go down to verse 19. This priest king, Melchizedek, and he blesses him and said, "Blessed be Abraham by God the Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. These 3 mysterious verses that are thrown into the middle of the chronicle of the war of the 5 kings and the 4 kings seems to come out of nowhere. Melchizedek comes out of nowhere, and then as soon as he's introduced, he disappears and we don't ever hear from him again. Mysterious, enigmatic. And it is those 3 verses that the preacher in Hebrews wants to explain to his audience today. So let's turn to Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 1. Look at how he exposits those 3 verses in Genesis 14. For this Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and then he blessed him. And to him Abraham appointed 1/10 part of everything. Now he is first, by the translation of his name, a king of righteousness and justice. But he is also the king of Salem, Shalem, which means the king of peace. So the preacher here is going to make something of Melchizedek's name. What does his name mean? Now, his audience had to have already known this, but I want to give it to you. Melchizedek. You could put a little dash between the I and the Z of Melchizedek. That dash between the I and the Z, there's 2 words here. Melech means a king, but Melchi, okay, so CH in Hebrew is a ch. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between the English Melchiz and the Jewish Melch. Melchi means my king. The second part of the word tzedek. Tzedek is a beautiful Hebrew word that is used to describe God. It means just and righteous. My king, just and righteous. Melchizedek, my king, just and righteous. So something profound about this enigmatic, mysterious king priest that comes out to meet Abraham. He was before Aaron, before the Torah, before Moses, before Isaac. And he is already this priest king of Jerusalem, and his name means the king of justice, the king of righteousness, the king of peace. And what has a beautiful ring to that is those are all the words that are used to describe the divine rule of God. And those are the words that are used to describe God's future Messiah. A priest king that will be righteous. A priest king that would be just. A priest king that would usher in peace. Let me show you how that's used of the Messiah. First, let me give you this commentary note. In Hebrew, justice and righteousness are often closely related with the word tzedek. Tzedek is the end of Melchizedek. Encompassing both meanings, tzedek is often translated as justice, but it also carries the connotation of righteousness and fairness and morality. The concept of tzedek is seen as a fundamental value in Judaism, encompassing more than just fair treatment, but also embracing morality and righteousness. The concept of tzedek is also used to describe the attributes of God, who is referred to as the righteous God, Elohim tzedek, and the Lord of our righteousness, Yahweh tzedek, highlighting the importance of justice and righteousness in the divine realm. The word tzedek is so rich and powerful that it makes this enigmatic character that only shows up for 3 verses, says something profound about him. That he was God's priest king. That he was an image and a type of the Messiah because he was righteous, he was just, and he would usher in peace. That name is really what the preacher wants to drive home in the name of his congregation, in the mind of his congregation. Let me show you how those names relate to the coming Messiah. Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 5. We're looking for the words righteous, just, and ushering in peace. Jeremiah 23:5, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous tzedek branch, and he will reign as a king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In Jeremiah's day, the time of the Babylonian invasion, Jeremiah was already seeing God raising up a king like Melchizedek. A king that is righteous and just. It's so easy to forget about Melchizedek already having played that role long before Israel was ever a reality. Also in Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you righteous. There's our word. He's righteous and he'll have salvation. He's humble and he's mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Verse 10b, and he will speak peace, shalem, Salem. He'll usher in peace to all the nations, not just Jerusalem, but to all of the nations. He's going to bring peace, and his rule shall be from the sea to the sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. Let's go back to our text. The preacher moves forward in verse 3, Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 3. He's still talking about Melchizedek, and he says, and he was without father or mother or genealogy, having neither a beginning of days nor an end of life, but he was made like homoio. We've seen that before. He was made like the Son of God, and continues to be a priest forever. The idea that he was made like a Son of God. Jesus was made like his brothers when he became flesh and blood. So this homoio, this word to be made like, Jesus was made like his brothers in order to intercede for them. But in this case, Melchizedek was made like the Messiah, made like Jesus. Because God was showing us from the ancient days what he was about to do in the future. So he is saying clearly, made like, Melchizedek was a type and a shadow of the king priest that God would bring later. And what's important to emphasize in this is Melchizedek was superior to Abraham, the father of Israel. And if Melchizedek is superior to Abraham, then that means he is superior to all of Abraham's descendants, superior to Moses, superior to Aaron, superior to the Levitical priesthood, because this king priest came out of nowhere. He blessed Abraham, and Abraham paid him homage. That's what he's saying in all of this. And this mysterious figure of Melchizedek was a type and a shadow of the mysteriousness of the Messiah. He draws attention to the fact that he didn't have parents and that his life never ended. That's a little complicated for us. So let's dig into that. Are you beginning to see from the nature of the text why last week's sermon was important? There's more that I want to tell you guys, but I'm afraid you're getting sluggish. I'm afraid you're starting to close your eyes and snore. I need you guys to be on the edge of your seat and attentive and awake, because this is some complicated stuff. I'm not saying that to you. The preacher was saying it to his audience. Funny. Nothing changes, does it? So the preacher is saying this to his audience. I got something to explain, but you got to be paying attention. Let's look at this quote here. This is not a historical argument. Nothing in the Old Testament suggests that Melchizedek was historically had no parents and was not born and did not die. And our author's argument does not necessarily show that he thought this was to be the case. It is rather an argument from literary silence, setting Melchizedek up as a literary model for the eternal Son of God. That's complicated. It plainly says he didn't have parents, he didn't have a genealogy, and he never died. That's what the text in Hebrews plainly says. But the commentary on this says, but hold on, not so fast. What's going on in the text? There have been some that have postulated and preached that Melchizedek actually was an early version of Jesus. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's right. But how can he refer to a guy that didn't have parents and never died? How can that be possible? And let me try to explain to you. In the ancient rabbinical tradition, the ancient rabbis had a principle of biblical interpretation. You know, they held to a strong, rigorous, strict interpretation of the Old Testament. And it was the rabbis that made all the decisions on how you interpret the Old Testament. One of the sayings of the rabbis in that time was, if it's not in the Torah, it doesn't exist. You know, the Church of Christ has kind of done something similar to that. We speak where the Bible speaks, and we're silent where the Bible's silent. We've kind of done that. I don't know that that's I don't know if that's always accurate. But that was kind of the Jewish tradition. If the Torah says it, then it's real. If the Torah doesn't say it, then it didn't exist. And because of that mindset, because of that oral tradition, the rabbis could say, Nowhere in the Torah does it say Melchizedek had a mom and dad. Now, we don't do that today. We don't argue from silence. That's a bad way to argue. Because the text doesn't say something, you can't create an argument on that. But in the ancient rabbinic tradition with the Torah, that was the way they read Torah. And so God is condescending to that understanding and that belief. The Torah doesn't say Melchizedek had a mom and a dad, therefore he didn't have a mom and a dad. The Torah doesn't say Melchizedek died, therefore Melchizedek never died. So the author here, the preacher of Hebrews, is using that ancient Semitic tradition that if it's not in Torah, it doesn't exist. He's using that ancient tradition to show the similarity between this guy that we have this ancient tradition about. This guy that we have this ancient tradition that he didn't have a mom and dad. He didn't die. He was the king priest of Jerusalem. He was the king priest of righteousness and justice and peace. This guy that we have a tradition about. You ought to be able to recognize the Messiah because God used your tradition to show you what your Messiah would look like. That's the argument. Verse 4 in Hebrews. See how great this man was to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils. Verse 6. But this man who does not have his descent from them, he's not a descendant of Israel, he received tithes from Abraham. And he blessed Abraham who had the promises. Verse 7 is critical. It is beyond dispute that the inferior, Abraham, is blessed by the superior, Melchizedek. The preacher is saying, in your own tradition, the king priest that was superior to Abraham is exactly what God has done in Jesus the Messiah. God has made him a king priest in the order of Melchizedek, in the order of your ancient tradition of a man that didn't have beginning or end, that didn't die, that was superior in every way to Abraham and all of his descendants. God gave you that mystery, that enigma, to show you that your Messiah would be a priest like that. He wouldn't be a priest like the Aaronic priesthood. He wouldn't be a high priest like the Levitical priesthood. He would be an enigmatic, mysterious high priest that was superior to Abraham and all of his descendants. He wanted to make that connection in their mind. To the Christian readers, God had revealed a type and a shadow of this mysterious, enigmatic high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He had revealed it 2,000 years before Jesus came. And this mysterious king priest had divine qualities of tzedek, justice and righteousness, and shalem, peace, that he would usher in. To the Christians who had given up the old Mosaic Aaronic traditions, he was transplanting them, he was embedding them in much better soil, much healthier, richer, nutrient-dense reality. Getting them out of the Mosaic Aaronic tradition and planting them in this new order of Melchizedek tradition. You're in a much richer, healthier, nutrient-dense soil now. The soil that you've been planted in now is superior to Abraham and all of his descendants. That's this new understanding that he's trying to create for his readers. To his Christian readers, you are participating now in something superior. Just as Melchizedek was superior to Abraham, Jesus was not an afterthought on God's part. Jesus, a king priest in the order of Melchizedek, has always been there from the beginning. And it was part of a promise that was given by God. And it's part of God's unchangeable purpose. And he says, that's what you can hang your hat on. That is what you can anchor your soul to, is Jesus being Tzedek. Superior in every way, that's what you can anchor your soul to. That's the promise, and that's the nature of God's unchangeable character and purpose. And the fact that it had already been revealed in your scriptures according to your tradition, you should understand that God was telling you ahead of time what he was going to be doing in the future. Praise God. Let's just pause right there, guys. We'll stick a pin right there. We'll stop. And that was just scratching the surface. That was just a little bit of background and introduction to this text that the preacher is using to transplant his readers out of the soil of Judaism, Torah, and Levitical priesthood, and to transplant them into this better, more fertile, more nutrient-dense soil, a new king priest in the order of Melchizedek, a king that would be righteous and just and usher in peace.